want to know about your early background. What caused you to want to be a political journalist? You actually talk about one incident in the book.
So in the Ocasio-Cortez chapter, I write how when I first learned about her candidacy and started looking into her background, the feet in both worlds part of it really struck me as authentic in a way that it appeared inauthentic to a lot of other people. Later, when she became famous, the right had this field day of like they took a picture of her house in Yorktown and said, look, she lived in a big house, not in the Bronx. Here's this nice high school that she went to. Look, it has a roof. She went to a college. They like really lit into this. But what had really appealed to me about it is that she left the Bronx. Her father kept the co-op apartment that they had in the Bronx, but then the family chipped in and bought a place about 45 minutes north of the Bronx. And so she would go back and forth. So they moved to Yorktown so that she could go to the public schools. She and her brother could go to the public schools there, but a lot of weekends and then probably a lot of time in the summers were spent back down in the Bronx. And in some ways, that type of life gives you a better perspective on what life is like in the Bronx than somebody who never leaves the Bronx. Because if you never leave the Bronx, this is just life.
Yeah.
But she has talked about that drive down, or that trip down from Yorktown into the Bronx, and just seeing, minute by minute and mile by mile, the socioeconomic status of the view out the window evolving. And so when you see that, you think, wait a minute, the people that I know in this world are no better, are no different than the people that I know in this world. So why is it that the people in this world are suffering through all these inequities and the people in this one are not? And so it forces the mind to start seeing things in a political lens, because the only answer is that there's something unfair here. And if there's something unfair, then what is it? And I experienced that in a way myself, and this is, I think, the thing you're referring to, in that, so I was born in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which would actually be the thing that a lot of political candidates would love to just point to every time. But for me, that was the Yorktown for me. My parents divorced fairly early, and my mother moved down to the eastern shore of Maryland, very rural, poor area, and she raised my brother and I, and we were kind of poor for the poor area. Like the other poor people would make fun of us for being poor. And so, but every other weekend, I would go back to Allentown. My brother and I would go back to Allentown, where my father was a school psychologist for the Allentown School District for 30 plus years. And from the 70s up through today, or up through maybe 10 years ago, that was an occupation that afforded like a comfortable life. Not a wealthy existence, but one where like everything worked, and like the house was not a physical danger to the people that lived in it. And so like seeing that every 2 weeks, and then several weeks in the summer, then going back and forth, like it gave me an ability to kind of start to analyze the situation in a way that I probably wouldn't have had if I was only raised in that town. And at the same time, it gave me an appreciation for kind of like mindset and what education can do, in the sense that even though everything around me was trash, like I always assumed that I was going to go to college. Like there was no question in my mind, even as I did terribly in school. There was no question that like my mother went to college, her mother went to college, my father's mother, like my grandmothers, all of them went to college. And so it was just a thing we were going to do. And so while so many of my friends from the Eastern Shore of Maryland didn't ever think that, didn't think they were going to go to college, and they didn't. As a result, I did. And so I also saw, like throughout that time, the small benefits that government was providing, and that mattered. So like food stamps, like free lunch, like public health care, like these were all things that like made our existence less barbaric. And so it gave me a real understanding that government could be a force for like doing something decent.
And what got you into political journalism? And mention that anecdote in the book.
Yeah, and this is kind of a footnote, and like the book is sort of like a journalism memoir in footnotes. Like if you bother to read the footnotes, which you don't have to, it's a lot of like where the story came from and like what the backstory was or how this quote came about or something like that. So in this case, it was around the Iraq War, and so during the lead up to the war and the early part of the war, I was a graduate student at the University of Maryland, and I was heavily active in what the group was called Peace Forum, very clever, 4UM.
Mm-hmm.
And we threw rallies, against the war. We would march in the bigger marches. We would lobby the graduate student government. We even took over one day the graduate student government and passed a resolution against the Iraq War. And I remember like the feeling of intense importance of this, that like if we could get the University of Maryland's graduate student government on record against invading Iraq, that it would matter. And I still think it's a good thing to do, and it builds
That's how
graduate support.
Marshall Prakash started.
There you go.
She took over the president's office at the University of Massachusetts Amherst on the divesting from fossil fuels issue.
Yes.
And look what it led to.
And so one of the moments, and this is the one I mentioned in the book, there was and I don't remember the exact date, but there was a massive anti-war rally in Washington. Felt like 250,000 people, maybe 500,000. It was just absolutely huge march in the streets. And then the next day in the Washington Post, there's like a story this long on page like 16.
Right.
And it's like,
what the hell?
and so many of our other actions at the university were aimed at like getting into the student newspaper or like getting into the like local section of the Post. And I remember thinking like, there's like 250,000 people came out, 1,000 people probably put in like weeks of work, putting this together, and the result is like 6 inches in the Washington Post. This is not efficient.
Yeah.
I was like, well, why don't I cut out the middleman here and why don't I become the reporter?
Yeah.
Since nobody else thinks that this is important, and I do, if I become the reporter, then I can write the story about this event that took place or about this thing that I'm mad that the media is not covering. Then I can actually just cover it. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that there was room. I think I hit a lucky time in the media where like the web was rising, Huffington Post was becoming a thing, and so but there was I was right that there was a demand out there for those stories. I mean, you wouldn't have 250,000 people in the street if nobody cared.
Right. What was your most favorite article that you've ever written, or the article that you're most proud of?
It was we published it I think in 2015, and it was a 20,000 word investigation into the heroin and opioid treatment industry, because there had been so much conversation around the idea that we need to treat the opioid epidemic like a public health crisis, and everybody needs treatment rather than incarceration. And so then we asked, well, what is this treatment that people are saying is the solution to this crisis? So we looked at the actual treatment industry and found that it was just carnage, and found that people going through it had just an absolutely horrible success rate, and that the basically, and this is a controversial subject, but like trying to apply the tenets of Alcoholics Anonymous to opioids winds up not working for tens of thousands of people a year, and they die. And for many people, that would be seen as an acceptable outcome because it would show other people the dangers associated. They've gone, like the ideologues that kind of run the treatment industry have gone around the bend in a lot of ways. And so we exposed that, and it led to some significant change in the industry. So that's the one I'm most proud of. Opioid deaths have continued to soar, so it clearly did not pop the problem.
You wrote a book about the move from big money to movement campaigns, yet chose not to write about Bernie Sanders' campaign, which was a huge movement campaign, and I'm wondering why.
The part of the Sanders campaign that I chose to focus on was the distributed organizing team.
Right.
So it's complicated, but it was like originally part of like the digital team, and then they got moved over to like the organizing side, but they were basically a group of kind of renegade organizers who were trying to figure out a way to take the energy that the Sanders campaign had behind it, and the kind of list of activists that it had been collecting, and turn that into active voter
this
contacts.
Becky?
Yeah, so this was
Zach Exley and Claire Sandberg. I have my own story when you're done.
And then Zach brought Becky Bond on. Zach Mallitz was running their Texas version of it. And then they brought in other interesting people like Corbin Trent. Who is now Ocasio-Cortez's communications director. They hired Shroykot Chakrabarty, who had basically left Silicon Valley to join the Sanders campaign. He's an engineer. He and Corbin helped found Justice Democrats. He's now AOC's chief of staff. Zach Exley recruited a ton of community college students out here, mostly Orange County here. That's here for me. And one of them, Alexandra Rojas, like most of them are still involved with the Bernie campaign now. One of them, Alexandra Rojas, was like a second-year community college student, drops out of school basically, joins the Bernie Sanders campaign, and is now the executive director of Justice Democrats. And so I do write about that organizing operation within the Sanders campaign, and what came out of that. And this will probably be an answer to a lot of the other, if there are other questions about like what wasn't written about. Partly, this is a living book. That doesn't mean that everybody shouldn't buy this one. And actually buy three copies of it. And actually, there is a reason you should buy it because, let's say a year or two, I'll do a revision and an update to it that will, go backwards and cover more time before it. We'll go forward, of course, and cover what hasn't happened yet. But we'll also go deeper in some of the areas that I haven't covered yet. But part of the answer is I've been working on this book off and on for sort of like 10 years or so. Wow. But I had never, it was a document that was just kind of ephemeral and just notes and ideas. And then after Ocasio-Cortez won, I took a look at everything I'd put together and asked, like, is the material there for a book now? And is there a narrative for a book? And what had always been missing was kind of a protagonist. You had Sanders in 2015, but the question was, is that a one-off phenomenon organized around Bernie? Or is this the beginning of a movement that's going to reshape politics? And AOC's win in last June gave the hope that this is a movement that's growing beyond Sanders.
And I was leading LA for Bernie, and then I became a delegate for him. And I was very partisan Bernie. I was telling somebody earlier today that I own 15 Bernie shirts, and I wore one of them every day for a year. I was literally a walking billboard for this man. I ate, slept, and dreamed Bernie and his campaign. We had a LA for Bernie, orientation meeting on June 26th, which was a full month before
15.
2015, which was a full month before the July 29th house parties. Yeah. And I actually had taken Marshall Ganz's class, Leadership, Organizing, and Action, and brought in somebody to talk about public narrative, because I thought it was very important to use Obama's model, Organizing for Obama, which became Organizing for America, to have us all be surrogates for Bernie and to tell our personal story and go out and build up, the movement. And almost immediately clashed with Zach, because he was trying to do it. They were trying to prove something, that they could do everything digitally. And that you would just sign up and you would put an event on the website, it would go on the map, people could go to the map, see the event, and show up. But what happened was you lost that camaraderie of what it was like to build an organized group on the ground, which is what we were doing with our LA for Bernie groups.
Right.
And people meeting together and becoming like a family and becoming a team, and that's really what generated the momentum to do these things.
Right.
Now, I know you say somewhere in the book, I marked this down, that a lot of these chalking the blocks, honking waves, all these other kind of visibility events that we did were useless, or somebody in the campaign thought they were useless because they weren't translating into voters.
Right.
And we could sort of debate that. I always say, take everybody's email list whenever you have a contact, and which is what they're trying to do now with the Burn app. But I said to him, why are you not putting these groups? We have Facebook groups like Silver Lake for Bernie, South Bay for Bernie, Santa Monica for Bernie. We had 40 of them. Why aren't you putting them on, the website so people could join? And he's like, well, there's a lot of infighting within those groups. That's true. Some of them are just Facebook groups. That's true. And I said, but still, you could put them up. People could see for themselves. I started going to the map, looking at the events, and poaching their people. So I did it reverse. And I contacted a woman from Ventura County who was going to be tabling at the farmers market. And I had an experience. Our Ventura County activists for Bernie tried to table there, and the guy erroneously told them that it was private and they couldn't do that for a political candidate. So we were going to go the following week armed with the copy of the Prune Yard versus the state of California decision. And so I called her up and she goes, oh, thank God someone from the campaign called me. I never did this before. It was horrible. The man was so mean to me, chased me away. I'm like, okay, I'm not with the campaign, but I can hook you up with a group, and and so it goes from there. So when I asked Zach about that, when he came out here for a November 15 barnstorm in Beverly Hills, I said to his face, you wrote that great article in the Huffington Post about how it was so successful for Obama, that method of organizing. How come you decided not to do it for the Bernie campaign? And his response to me was, we decided to go in a different direction. And I'll never forget that, because that's what an employer tells you when they don't want to hire you. So it was really...
Right. So I thought that was an important push within the campaign to cover, and it evolved substantially, even past November 15th. That was around the time that they were still figuring out how these barnstorms were going to work, because at that point, and they've admitted this since, they were kind of falling on their face a lot as they were trying to rely on the digital organizing to translate it into actual organizing. And it wasn't really until December, January that it started clicking. And it seems like it started clicking when they started returning more of the power down to grassroots groups, which by that point you're already into Iowa,
right?
And so a lot of it wasn't working by then, or it was too late by then. I think I don't know what the experience is right now between the kind of pop-up groups and the campaign. That's something worth looking into. Several of the people, as I'm sure you know, left. After they left the Bernie Sanders campaign, they actually went to Beto in 2018 for his Senate run. Zach Mallitz and Becky Bond, and the difference between, interestingly, Beto and the Bernie campaign was that Becky and Zach pitched this idea that we're basically just going to empower people on the ground to organize groups and to set up headquarters and to run canvassing operations and to run texts for Beto and will distribute all the power downward. And to Beto, that actually felt wonderful to him.
Yeah.
Because he's not the kind of person, as you can imagine, that wants to like sit around and organize a top-down campaign. Not necessarily an ideology, it's just, you say you can harness all of the like energy that my viral videos are creating, and then I don't have to do anything else other than like the thing that he loves to do, which is like go and talk to people at coffee shops and town halls and fire halls. So I'll do that, you'll do this, and we'll have a campaign. They're like, yes. And he's like, great. So he completely empowered them to do it. And they had over 800 of these pop-up volunteer run headquarters, which was something that the Sanders campaign wouldn't allow. They wouldn't allow volunteers to have campaign offices.
Although we had them anyway.
We have.
Right.
There was one in Highland Park.
Right.